God, the most merciful and most compassionate, and may the blessings of Allah be upon all His messengers. We'd like to welcome you, first of all, to this seminar, which we are holding as part of a 3-day seminar we hold in the morning on the works of Moroccan philosopher Taha Abdel Rahman. This evening we have a group of distinguished speakers with us. Each one of them will be tackling part of the trusteeship paradigm in the works of Taha Abdel Rahman as a general Islamic principle and as specifically as part of the paradigm of trusteeship. We have Muhammad Oria first. Thank you very much, Dr. Mu'taz. My paper will be focusing on Islamic philosophy and Islamic ethics in Taha Abdel Rahman's philosophy and what he calls the trusteeship paradigm, to be presented not only for Muslims but for the rest of the world as Islamic ethical principles. Before we discuss the main attributes of ethical principles in Islam, but we have to say first of all that Taha Abdel Rahman's work starts with providing a critique of the Western secularist project so far as ethics are concerned. And we found this in most his writings, especially in a book called CILE al-Akhlaq, The Question of Ethics, which in this book, Taha Abdel Rahman provides a critique of the philosophy in the West, which dealt with the relationship between the religion and philosophy from 3 dimensions. First of all, the relationship between ethics and religion, and in conjunction between both of them and as an independent principle. And Taha starts with the first view, which Taha says emanates from 2 important points. First of all, believing in God and the will of God. And in our reading of this critique, we understand that Taha does not mind per se the Christian paradigms when presented at the time of Saint Thomas Aquinas, and also when he talks about the relationship of religion to ethics, and he goes through what Kant says about man's goodwill, and through this goodwill Kant says that the ethical principles or the principles of ethics do not necessarily have to emanate from religion. It can come from reason and reason only. And he starts this book, and in the introduction to 1793, he says something like the ethics as based on the perceptions of man do not need religion. So Kant is very clear about this, but Taha criticizes this approach and says all Kant's terminology and terms are religious in origin, but he substitutes them with the other ones, and he says that in this question that reason can replace God, and in some other questions which belonged to religion, now Kant secularized them and So the concept of ethics, so far as Taha is concerned, remain to be religious or emanating from religion. And what Taha rejects in Kant's thought is the independence or isolation of ethics from religion. As for the last view, which pertains to the separation or independence of ethics and religion, he refers to David Hume, who, through his well-known ethical law, takes the religious principles or rules outside the ethical system, and he says that religion is not suitable medium for deriving ethical considerations. And this is a principle which Taha rejects and says that modernism established ethics which are not religious. It gave up on the religious terminologies and substituted them with secularist principles. Here, in the third stage of his critiques to many philosophers and like Habermas, Apple, and many others, and lastly Hans Jonas, who is known to be the founder of the idea of responsibility, but Taha here, when he talks about, when Hans Jonas talks about fear and responsibility, and that human beings have to take into account to protect this environment for generations to come, Taha says this question will not dissuade man from doing what he does in destroying his environment. Human beings can be dissuaded from destroying the environment if he fears punishment. And this dichotomy of fear and punishment, which he finds in religion and especially in monotheistic religions. So therefore, he dresses up Hans Jonas's idea in a way, although Hans Jonas does not have such a perception for religion in the first place, especially in another book maybe Taha did not know about, and in the other book Hans Jonas says that the deity or God, and he's talking about the Jewish deity or God who could not stop the Holocaust, and this God needs help, so to speak. So this kind of discourse is difficult to accept from a religious point of view. So therefore, Taha was not correct in making right or the principle of responsibility in Hans Jonas's writings. So therefore, when in his critique of these ideas or based on modernity, what he suggests to us, Taha suggests to us, that to have Islamic ethics which emanate from a Muslim environment. But before that, he speaks about two things he takes for granted that any reader of Taha Abdul Rahman should accept. First of all, that the morality or the ethical nature of humanity or human beings, and the ethics being derived from religion. So what does Taha do with these two principles. He combines reason on the one hand and Sharia and the heart and man's feelings. So what is Sharia and what is reason? And what is reason is heart and feelings too. I will not delve into too many details now. I'll leave that to the questions and answers session if we have time for that. But in this particular question, in Western thought, Greek thought separate between the logos and the mythos, and therefore this led to some wrong beliefs, even amongst Muslim philosophers when they isolated or separated between reason and what is divine law or shara. So what does Taha suggest? Taha suggests Islamic ethics. He derives from 3 incidents which determine the general Muslim imagination here. First of all, he combines between reason and the divine law or shara, which becomes necessary to have philosophical Islamic ethics. And this combination is based on God, who is the lawgiver here, or Shara provider, and a human being who is endowed with reason. And of course, he bases this on verse 119 from Al-A'raf Surah, which starts with God asking human beings, "Aren't I your God?" And they say, "Yes, you are." So this agreement, Taha gives a very high rank, and he elevates it to the standing of nature in the Enlightenment philosophies. And of course, therefore, it can be accepted in Western philosophy that even in the Enlightenment philosophy, they accept something in seen or like nature, which or the principle of when people can get together, combine their efforts to establish a just society without knowing each other necessarily, as long as we live in equality amongst us. So this is found in the Western thought. As for the combination between the heart and reason, is the incident of what happened to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ when he was a young boy, when an angel opened his chest and purified his heart. And this is an incident Taha attaches a lot of meaning to, because in opening the heart is the act of renewal and the preparation to prepare the Prophet to carry this burden of commissioning him to be a prophet and the messenger later on. The third incident with which I'll conclude is the combination between the reason and hiss, or what's called the act of being able to feel and be sensitive to. And here he derives this perception of changing the direction of Qibla, where Muslims face when they offer prayers, from Jerusalem to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And Taha attaches this to this a dimension of ethics, or ethical dimension. So the question to him what does Taha tell us? Taha tells us that that this incident made the Muslim come out of the feeling of Mecca or the Kaaba or the direction of prayer to the actuality of worshipping, and which is a message to Muslims and humanity in general. So therefore, ethics can be Puritanian in nature or directional. And by that, I am thanking you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed. The second speaker is Dr. Hart Verzend from Melbourne University, and he will be talking about the mystic element in Taha's literature.
Yes, I've been asked to give a quick overview of the role that Sufism plays in the works of Taha Rahman. To gauge the importance of Sufism, I must first maybe say that his project is holistic. It ranges over philosophy, fiqh, translation, and many other areas of investigation. And Sufism is omnipresent in all of these features. It's sort of the cement that seems to hold it together. So Sufism has been central to Taha Rahman from very early on, when he was taken to meet Sheikh in his hometown of Ajdida in Morocco. And he has been in a Buchashia order for a very long time. And the ideas of the Sufi view of life has also entered his analysis of philosophy. In particular, his analysis of what he called reason, or al-aql. And why reason in particular? Well, to understand that, it's good maybe to go back to the kind of context that he was writing in, or who he was writing against, to be more precise. So in the 1980s in Morocco, there was a growing interest in the analysis of reason, or particularly in the works, for instance, of Muhammad Abd al-Jabri, celebrated Moroccan philosopher, historian. And the idea was that there are many problems in the Arab Islamic world, and these are caused to a large extent by the structural problems in the way that Arabs or Muslims perceive the world, or there's something wrong in the way that they engage with the world. And by showing what these structural problems are, you can address them and look for a way to improve your situation in the future. And what someone like Abd al-Jabri did, he said, well, there are two. He went into a historical investigation of Arab Islamic history, and he found that there are three kinds of reason. And he called these the bayan, which he sort of linked to legal research, the irfan, which he linked to to Sufism, to tasawwuf, and burhan, which he associates with Aristotelian logic, and he also tends to see that as sort of the adoption of burhan in the West. He sees as the reason for the West's rise in the Renaissance and afterwards. So he has what he then says is, well, there's a order of these three kinds of reasons. The lowest form for him is irfan. He sees Sufism as completely irrational and therefore not really fit to help you in getting along with the world, to improve your situation. There's bayan, which is too traditional, and it's logical, but it doesn't really help you be creative. And there's Burhan, and that really, according to him, is the way forward. And what Taha Abdul Rahman, being a Sufi, of course, doesn't agree with this at all. And what he does is he sort of turns this on his head. So he says, instead of taking Irfan to be the lowest form of reason, he takes it to be the highest form. And the lowest form for him is the kind of reason that Abd al-Jabri, Muhammad Abd al-Jabri, associates with the West, namely Burhan. He calls these by different names. So he says, well, the Burhan, he calls that al-aql al-mujarrad, or abstract reasoning. And he says that that is the kind of reasoning that just takes note of what's out there. So it tries to analyze what kinds of relations there are, what kinds of causal relations there are in the world, but it doesn't give you any kind of ethical standard. It just shows you what is, quote unquote, objectively there. Then he says, well, what al-Jabri takes to be bayan, he calls al-aql al-musaddad, it's guided reason. And this is the kind of reason which is informed by, in terms of its ethical principles by the revealed law, by the Quran and Sunnah in particular. And what this does is that these sources give you a general moral standard by which to live. But it's only a general standard, so it only gives you rules by which you should live. One step up from that, and that's the most perfect stage because these kinds of reasons are for him stages in your development as a human being that you can attain to. The most perfect stage for him is the Sufi stage, and what this takes, it includes this objective view of what things are like. It includes this notion of the general rules that you ought to live by, but it also, through engaging in Sufi practice, according to him, you get attuned to how the world is behind the appearances. So this is the traditional difference between a zahir and a batin, which is, of course, there in the Sufi traditions from the earliest beginnings. So what he says is, well, Sufi practice helps you, it reveals to you, or it makes you, it attunes you to what is behind the appearances and what is in the essences of things, of living things, of inanimate things, of other human beings. It gives you a sense, therefore, because it gives you a sense of the essence of what's out there, what's behind the appearances, it gives you a sense of the intentions of God, the intentions that God has with his creation. And by thus attuning yourself to the situation, you can you can apply the general rules that are revealed, that have been revealed earlier. But you can do it in a way that is particular to each situation. So what he tries to argue for is that because every situation is different, not just because there are different circumstances, but also because it's a different person that engages in it. So every action for you or me would be different, not just because we're in different positions or in different times, but also because we have a different history, and we're different persons, and different things are expected of us. And by becoming aware of ourselves through this practice and becoming aware of what's out there, we are able to gauge which situation we are in and what we are asked to do in that particular situation. So it is a more perfect way of being ethical, because it's not just applying rules blindly, it's doing so with a kind of knowledge of how to do it and why to do it at each particular time. And it's therefore also always practical. So it's never just a theoretical engagement. It's not something that you can always just learn in books. You have to do it all the time and be engaged in this kind of practice all the time. So what he tries to advocate a sort of development, a certain kind of development of the self. And what this does is it imbibes meaning into what would otherwise be a somewhat meaningless world, as he describes it. And he does this in particular, and that's, I'll come to my closing point here. He does this in particular, he points, or he emphasizes this in his critique of modernity. Because one of the things that he tries to do in arguing for this Sufi practice, this Sufi way of looking at things, is that he contrasts this with Western modernity. So he goes back to the what he called the abstract reason, and he says, look at all the ills of modern society. These are all caused by the fact that people haven't got any kind of ethical standard for how they ought to act. Once they sort of learn how to see meaning in creation, learn how to sort of turn away from this meaningless and objective view of the world that's presented to us in modern science, we can start to act in ways that are, we can start to constrain ourselves in ways that are ethical. So what you see in his use of Sufism is that on the one hand he uses it as a contrast to Western modernity, and thus uses it as a critique, but he also uses it as an alternative for it. He says, well, there's another way, and it leads through this Sufi practice. And as a final note, I'll say that there might also be some Western equivalents of this turn to development of the self and attuning yourself to the situation. Particularly, I'd say in philosophers like John McDowell, who have gone through sort of an Aristotelian phase in their thinking and have gone to the same conclusion that you can only really cognize what is asked of you in this world if you sort of through training and not just through learning rules. And I think he sort of, the way in which someone like John McDowell would argue for this is somewhat similar to what we see in John McDowell, or what we see in Taha Abdul Rahman. But that's just one illusion that I'll leave you with.
Thank you, Harold. The next speaker is Dr. Ramin Harvey. He's professor at the college, Abraham College in London. So he will speak for 20 minutes. Yeah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Allahumma salli ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I'm going to speak today on an aspect related to the thought of Taha Abdul Rahman, which is his idea of the mithaq, or primordial covenant, and its presence and relation to Quranic ethics. Taha Abdul Rahman, in forming his i'timani or trustee paradigm, he puts a deal of emphasis on this idea, which is known from the Quran, of the initial covenant that was made between human beings and God. And this is, in many ways, a foundation for the ethical responsibility that human beings have in the world, and also he sees this as a universal notion that can be extended to humanity in general, because, of course, all of humanity, without exception, made this covenant. My focus today, as I'm not a scholar of Taha Abdul Rahman's thought myself, is to work from something I wrote in my book called The Quran and the Just Society. And this book was or is a study of the notion of social justice according to the Quran. In the first chapter, I devote this chapter to looking at what I call the Quranic moral narrative. This is the story that the Quran tells of human history and ethical responsibility. And having spent time over the last couple of days with scholars who do focus on the thought of Taha Abdul Rahman much more than myself, I've been pleased by how much consonance and complementarity I've found between what I've been thinking and also between the thoughts of Abdurrahman. One of the key ideas that illuminates our journey through the Quranic moral narrative is the idea of God's wisdom. That in God's wisdom all things begin and they end. While the Bible takes human history through a chronological story from the first man and woman all the way to the time of Moses and his people, the Quran is not structured in this way. The Quran presents in different surahs and verses different aspects of the human story, and it is up to the person who is seeking to interpret the Quran to bring these different aspects together and if you wish to retell that story. And this can be done in many ways, and I do not claim to have the only possible reconstruction here. But we should understand that God's wisdom is present in the primordial covenant and goes through all the way to the final eschatological reality, that the final time at the end of the human life and their eventual destination into paradise or into hell. Looking at the Quranic narrative, we will understand, and we must understand, that human history is only ethically meaningful due to the possession of moral responsibility. Human beings have this innate responsibility, and this is, I think, close to Taha Abdurrahman's idea that ethics is at the heart of the human being and can characterize the human being. In the verse 3372, we are given a powerful image of the vast natural elements cowering at the offer of the trust, al-amana. We offered the trust, al-amana, to the heavens, the earth, and the mountains, yet they refused to bear it and feared it. فَأَبَيْنَا أَنْ يَحْمِلْنَهَا وَأَشْفَقْنَا مِنْهَا. Humanity bore it. It has always been hasty and foolish. This verse's impact is heightened by the personification of the heavens, earth, and mountains with the plural feminine verbs, al-abayna, ashfaqna, which are usually reserved for intelligent beings. This personification highlights the importance of this moment in which the trust is offered, and that we learn that human beings are the ones who are to take this trust on. Furthermore, this trust, this amana, can be interpreted as symbolic of this moral responsibility accepted by humanity and enabling it to freely enter into a covenant with God. Human souls promise their Rabb that they shall recognize him and render their lives to his worship, which is the ultimate purpose of their existence. This idea is mentioned in 51:56. I created jinn and humankind only to worship me. And in this worship, ya'budun, can be understood and has been understood by exegetes as to recognize or intimately know, ya'rifun, God, Allah Most High. The Quranic Covenant has a reciprocal structure. Human beings, on the one hand, are obliged to fulfill their commitments, and in return, it is inconceivable that God, as Al-Hakim, will break his promise to them. The worldly life is the arena or the space of testing, as mentioned in 67:2. He is the one who has created death and life to test which of you is best in deeds. لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. When they return to him, they are promised just recompense for the manner in which they spent their lives, based on the internal state of their hearts and, of course, the actions of their limbs. However, as mentioned in 654, your Lord has taken it upon himself to be merciful. Thus, God's justice is balanced with his mercy, his rahmah, a defining attribute. The same can be said of the human level. A person's own adl is transcended by his or her ihsan, or spiritual excellence. In the Christian Bible, the Old and New Testaments are named after an English, they're called the Testaments because this is a word for covenant. This word testament means a kind of mithaq, covenant. And the idea is that the patriarchs, figures such as Abraham, and later the Israelites, made a covenant with God, one after the other. And for the Christians, they believe that this covenant was superseded or strengthened by a new one with Jesus. However, the Quran presents a different picture. a primordial covenant with all of humanity. So in 7:172 and 3, prophet is assumed. So when this is addressed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when your Lord took out the offspring from the loins of the children of Adam and made them bear witness about themselves, ala anfusihim, or upon their souls, he said, am I not your Lord? And they replied, yes, we bear witness. This is so you cannot say on the day of resurrection, we are not aware of this. Or it was our forefathers who before us ascribed partners to God, and we are only the descendants who came after them. Will you destroy us because of the deeds of those who invented falsehood? So these verses evoke this primordial time in which humanity collectively entered into a covenantal relationship with God, affirming their obligations to Him. What we have here in 7:172 is a bringing us directly into the scene. The Quran, as it were, zooms in on the scene in which this happens and gives us a privileged access to this time before our human lives. The call to testify and its response can be taken that the natural disposition or fitra of the human being is to incline towards belief in God, to be ready to believe in God. And the rationale, the reason given for this witnessing is to establish a proof to be used on the day of resurrection should human beings deny their responsibilities as servants entirely or blame their forebears for their disbelief. So the covenant is a freely made confirmation of an existing relationship. The human beings in their creation, in their soul's creation, have this certain relationship to their Lord and Creator. And the covenant is then a recognition of this and a free entry into this the human beings make. So here enters the concept of deen, religion. The deen is, as it were, in one interpretation, can be taken as living a life as a debt of one's own existence, accounted for by God on Yawm ad-Din, the day of reckoning. And there are other possible interpretations as well. In the primordial stage of history, each life to be is recorded as this debt. And the worldly existence that follows is for humans to spend their lives productively in worship of their Creator, fulfilling the obligations that are placed upon them. And the eventual reckoning shows either a profitable or loss-making transaction to be carried into eternity. This is one possible possibility, and it may not reflect the understanding of Taha Abdul Rahman on that point. And so the word deen is fundamental. It can be used in a positive or negative light within the Quran. You have phrases such as ad-din al-qayyim, ad-din al-haq, deen Allah. But also, it's possible to have the phrase غير الإسلامي دينا, to take another deen, or for you your deen and for me mine. So what we have in the Quran is a pattern in which human beings are given this deen in which to live and in which to fulfill this covenant which they have been given. The narrative of Adam is, in a sense, shows an archetype or prefigures what will come later with his descendants. It maps out for them the idea of stewardship, of obligation, transgression, and repentance. So Adam himself is given a responsibility. He has been as God is said to talks to the angels and says, "Indeed, I am placing upon the earth a steward. Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa." Likewise, when Adam and his wife are placed in the garden and they're given the obligation to not go near the tree, and they still eat from the tree, then this represents their first obligation that's been placed upon them as an aspect of their responsibility. And when they do not follow the prohibition, then they are sent out into the world, and they ask for forgiveness from their Lord, and Allah accepts the forgiveness, as mentioned in 2:37. He accepted his repentance. He is the ever-relenting, the most merciful, At-Tawwab Ar-Rahim. So in Adam, we have an example of the human life living according to the responsibility of the primordial covenant, and living transgressing, which is something that human beings will do, and then repenting and being placed back in the favor of God. And in this time as well, there is a divine promise of guidance, an allusion to the future, possible allusion to the future coming of revelation, and a place where the human story will end, either in a permanent return to paradise or to the torture of hell. So in the story of Adam, we have, even within Surah Al-Baqarah, we have, and especially supplemented with verses in Surah Al-A'raf, we have the whole pattern of the human moral life laid out as a paradigm, as a pattern for us to understand. And so the Adamic narrative leads to human beings in the world, and we can then look at how the Quran treats human beings that enter into the natural state within the world. And here you have again this notion of fitrah that emerges. The Quran also mentions what's known as al-mizan, or the scale. Allah says in Surah Al-Rahman, He has raised up the sky, He has set the scale, so you may not exceed in the scale. Set up the weighing scale with justice and do not fall short in the scale. He set down the earth for His creatures with its fruits, its palm trees, with sheathed clusters, its husked grain, its fragrant plants. So we have here the scale is revealed as for the testing of the ability of human beings and jinn to live according to it. The mizan is placed between the description of the sky, the sama, and the earth. And therefore, one can understand that the scale is a natural feature of the created environment and applies universally throughout it. The command, set up the weighing scale with justice, وَأَقِيمُ الْوَزْنَ بِالْقِسْطِ, utilizes a familiar metaphor for the just society. Wazna and mizan, both belonging to the root wazana, to weigh. A human level of action is envisaged that mirrors the divine, with the human steward, meant to measure out earthly justice according to the standards set by God. So human beings, when they are given their moral freedom, have to then live and act with justice on the earth. And so justice becomes central to the Quranic vision of human ethics. And likewise, in 30:30 is a verse that's often related to the verse of the Covenant. And to this discussion, we have Allah says, stand yourself up devoutly for the religion, the natural disposition God instilled in humanity. وَأَقِمْ وَجْهَكَ لِدِينِ الْحَنِيفًا فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا. There is no altering God's creation. That is the upright religion, though most people do not realize it. So the Quran understands that this human ability, this human natural disposition, this fitrah, is a disposition of ethics, and one that is knowledgeable about the human responsibilities. And I think in many respects this can parallel Taha Abdul Rahman's understanding of al-Din al-Fitriya, the original state of the deen of human beings, of the religion the human beings will understand and come to know in their very nature. So I will stop there and thank you for your patience today. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you very much, Ramin. Before I'll use my time for my intervention, I just want to say that you have before you a questionnaire. Please fill them out if you don't mind, and include your feedback on this seminar and your personal contact information if you wish to get to know about what our center does. Now we had 3 presentations. The first spoke to the features of ethical philosophies in Taha Abdul Rahman's writings. The second about the Sufi dimension in Abdul Rahman's works. And the third about the covenant. And the covenant is strongly linked to the concept of trusteeship, which is the title of this seminar. and the principle of amana. So therefore it is linked to an ethical that Abd Rahman calls ida'iyya, whereby everything that human beings enjoy are gifts from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he's trusted to deal with them and look after them. In the time given to me, I will talk about 4 points which are linked by one title called Taha Abd al-Rahman's Project and Context. First of all, the first point will be how should we understand Taha Abd al-Rahman? Secondly, is he a philosopher or a mutakallim? And thirdly, what are the features of his project? And number 4, is this project an individual one, individualistic one, or a communal, or one for community at large or humanity? So far as the first point is concerned, how we should understand Taha Abd al-Rahman's project, I think before that we have to deliver ourselves and liberate our minds from few things. First of all, that we should bring Taha Abd al-Rahman outside the internal, local, North African context, because this context, North African context, has its own perceptions, culture about Taha Abd al-Rahman is governed by a dichotomy, and it's captive to that, which is the government or the state, and the opposite side to that, or which is the Sufi schools, or what they so-called Zawiya, because Taha Abd al-Rahman being a Sufi and he is perceived as one, so therefore he is the other side, the opposite side of political discourse. And the other dimension is the political opposition. So we must take him out of these 3 dimensions, and should not be studied from the lens or through the lens of Sufism or as part of the king's narrative. And the third aspect of this, we should liberate our understanding or perception of Taha Abd al-Rahman, is the political activity. There is a problem. The so-called political Islam has influenced a large number of the youth and handed down from generation to generation the perception or the idea that the only way change can come through is through political activity, and Taha Abd al-Rahman is not a political activist. So therefore, people who disagree with him maybe by and large see this difference, and they look at him from this point of view, and also the view that Taha Abd al-Rahman has of political Islam in 2 dimensions: the Shi'at, represented by the Wilayat al-Faqih, and the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood, because he perceives them as part and parcel of the modernity or modernism, and especially in his early writings, because generally speaking, he used to complain from the Muslim Brotherhood, and because normally political activism and thought can be at opposite ends, and the Muslim Brotherhood's leadership in the 80s really complained about that, apart from Sayyid Qutb, who was not the product of the political Islam. He joined it later. We do not find any real thinkers or ideologues within political Islam. The other constraint that we should take him out of is the dichotomy of the Shaykh and Murid, the Sufi mentor and the followers. In Morocco also, or in North African countries, there is a perpetual animosity between the followers of Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri and Taha Abd al-Rahman, each belonging to sort of a different ideological standpoint. And also we should liberate Taha Abd al-Rahman from the populist Sufi traditions that everybody understands, and like dervishes and the like, because he's not like that. He does not follow a particular order, Sufi order, in the traditional way that people have come to know and be accustomed to, because he really has a very deep philosophical thinking. But all of this brings us into the question, where should we place him in the Arab intellectual or thought context? Maybe some can say or argue that he should be counted as one of the people who renew Islam or renew religion, like Muhammad Iqbal, although Taha Abd al-Rahman has a deeper thought and is more of a prolific writer. But they both have a Sufi component in their thinking, although their intellectual tools and background of each of them and the mechanisms each one of them uses and the methodology in presenting or arguing his ideas differ from one another. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, at the Arab level, the philosophical projects of renewing Islam are, I think, almost exclusively pertain to, and the only difference is they work to renew Arab thought. Like, for example, Muhammad Arkan and Muhammad Abd al-Jabri worked on the Arab thought or intellect, but Taha Abd al-Rahman uses philosophy as a tool. His project is philosophical. People like Jabari and Arkan use some philosophical tools they utilize to, in their way of critiquing Arab and Islamic thought in order to do some sort of a renewal of the Arab thought, similarly to attempts in Europe. So Muhammad Jabir al-Abri and Muhammad Arkan can be called researchers, but Taha Abd al-Rahman is a philosopher. This, of course, does not belittle Muhammad Arkan or Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri. He calls himself a researcher. He told me that in person. So therefore, the function which is carried out by each one of them is different than the other. So therefore, I'll move from the contemporary Arab context and to find a place for Taha Abd al-Rahman in the traditional Islamic context. This is rather difficult because Taha's discourse specifically, although it's true, he lists his references at the end of each book, and they include traditional books like there are mainly resources in Arabic and some modern books about philosophy. He hardly ever refers to contemporary Arab writings. So therefore, although there is a bibliography at the end, but he never quotes Quranic text or the sources he refers to in the text. In his way of writing does not include quotations. What he does in the margins or in the references, he mentions the reference. And also, this argumentation is not the type that can secede easily to quotations in that. But despite that, there's another point also that Taha presents his project as something of an innovation. So therefore, it will be difficult for us to place him within the traditional thinkers, but we can compare between Taha Abdul Rahman and Al-Ghazali, although Taha Abdul Rahman himself does not like that. We can make a comparison between the two men because there are similarities and dissimilarities. So far as the similarities are concerned, this is obvious. Both of them worked on renewing religion, and this is a very important factor. The other aspect of similarity, both of them absorbed the philosophy which was prevalent in his time in a very deep manner, and both of them are fully versed in Islamic traditions. The only one of the differences, Al-Ghazali did not really interact in a way with the Greek philosophy of his time, and Taha Abdul Rahman does, he critiques it, and he tries to establish a project of different modernisms and not just one example. So therefore, the other question is, how should we describe Taha Abdul Rahman, as a philosopher or mutakallim? In one aspect, he is similar to al-mutakallim because he bases his thought on ideas or convictions that he builds on, and this is like a theological position. But the problem here is Taha presents a critical perception of philosophy, and this makes it difficult to count him as a mutakallim. The concept of reason for Taha is an active or one built on a function or a practice, and not just an entity which exists purely theoretically. And also he has three types of reasons. The abstract one, which is to do with cognition, understanding, the tangible things, and what is, and also the guided and supported ones also, and also the supported one which understands things. So Taha presents a critical view of reason because, and here he is maybe building a new perception of philosophy itself. Secondly, Taha Abdul Rahman links theoretical observation and actual deeds and works. So therefore, the Sufi experimentation in his life complement reason and not an opponent, or they complement each other. And Taha Abdul Rahman, in his reasoning, similar to what Sufis call dhawq, or tasting or experimenting or living through the Sufi, because for a Sufi, the person or the Sufi who goes through this experience differs and in a way which is not similar to what a philosopher who deals in materialistic way. In the Islamic tradition, there is this linkage and interaction between Avicenna, Averroes, Al-Ghazali, have this aspect when linking the combination between what is experimental, practical, and what is theoretical. Reasoning, so far as Abdurrahman is concerned, is not exclusively philosophical in the way of looking for proof, because reasoning for him is argumentation, and argumentation as a methodology. And this is presented or known in Ilm al-Kalam, because Ilm al-Kalam has a more complete methodology than the philosophical one. And it has two main features. First, it's built on sort of a dialogue and sort of a dialectical exchange. And these are present in Ilm al-Kalam more than philosophy. So maybe this makes Taha Abdul Rahman more a philosopher. And he wrote a 4-volume book. It's one of the most complex books he wrote, and he excels in formulating philosophical concepts, and he delved into realms that nobody of his contemporary Arab thinkers entered, and that is to do with logic and language, because in fact his training was the field he was basically trained in. And also he dealt with the 3 schools of philosophy, the French, Anglo-Saxon, and German, although the French tradition is more present in his writings. The third point, what are the features of Taha Abdul Rahman's project? He works on renewing religion and criticizing or dealing or studying modernism. He presents a very complete or holistic approach. Also, and in his argumentation, through linking between the text and the context. So really his project establishes or works to establish an ethical Islamic modernism. Also, unlike other projects which I mentioned, his understanding of tradition includes 2 basic principles. First of all, the discoursal aspect of the text, and the second is the behavioral aspect of tradition. So tradition to him is not just a text, it's a text and a practice also, and also concepts and mechanisms to produce this or achieve these concepts. So we can't study both aspects in separation. Also, they are the result of interaction between the text and the historical context. So we cannot take the text in isolation from its context in reality. So therefore, our approach should be holistic, as is the case with his writings, and he looks upon as a complete system independent from others. And therefore, he tries to come up with a perception or view which is really combines between religion and philosophy. This was the Muslim philosophers' perception historically, or even with some Arab thinkers until the 60s, especially in Egypt. After the 60s, this new animosity between religion and philosophy started to appear. Even some Coptic philosophers like Karam used to think that the religion and philosophy are compatible and there is no animosity between them. So therefore, this animosity between the two is new with the appearance of the new secularist discourse. So Taha believes in combining the two as he criticizes or critiques Western modernism from two entry points. First of all, he's saying there is not just one modernism, there are many modernisms. So therefore, from a religious point of view, we cannot say that there is one absolute true modernism. Secondly, he suggests, in fact, solutions for the moral dilemmas or ethical dilemmas facing Western modernism or modernity. And he deals with this at two levels or through two main factors. First of all, he talks about the right to differ philosophically. He provides the grounding for the difference in philosophical understanding, and also the right to differ so far as the values are concerned. So therefore, we cannot speak of one unified ethical or value system because they emanate from different sources. Taha is a very rigorous, vigorous approach, but of course he critiques the Western modernity or modernism. Finally, about the question whether or not, or is his project an individualistic one, and maybe those who believe that emanate in their stance from a Sufi background, and of course some say that Sufi ethics are to do with al-fana, although there are many different ethics, not just one. It's true, his philosophy emanates from the self and the individual, but they do not stop there. And he presented by Taha Abdul Rahman cannot be reduced into one aspect, because he concerned himself with many other aspects. I'll leave it there and thank you for your kind attention.
Have your comment. No questions? I would like to thank you for inviting us. This discussion is specialized, however, we benefited from your interventions. What's the difference between the intellectual renewal and the religious renewal? You have differentiated between the two. And I don't understand the difference because I think they are intertwined. Because intellect is a produce of religion in accordance to our Arab culture. Any other questions? Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Thank you for your interventions. However, I would like to ask you a question regarding the last point you have floated. You said that Taha Abdurrahman adopts a number of modernity or modernism. He thinks that there are a plurality in the value system and so on and so forth. So how does he intersect with the postmodernists who think that there are plenty of terms of references rather than one term of reference in accordance with different experiences and so on and so forth? So how could Taha Abdurrahman, how did he deal with these kind of issues and with such plurality? How was he coherent in this regard? Because there are plenty of intellectual trends and different curricula and so on and so forth. But he's a monotheist. He believes in the oneness of God. So how was he coherent in tackling this plurality?
Assalamu alaikum. My question about Taha Abdurrahman, you mentioned that he was critical of political Islam. So how did he theorize producing a moral community? What type of program? Through education? How would this come about? What would be his approach for the lay person, the lay people, and the majority of people in society? Thank you, Jazakallah khair.
In the name of God, the most blessed, the most merciful, all blessings are due to our Prophet, peace be upon him. I would like to thank you all for talking about this illuminated, enlightened Moroccan scholar, Mr. Muhammad Auria, in his intervention was splendid. However, there was a bit of a loophole in terms of crossing the T's and dotting the I's in his intervention, and you had put a comparison between the ethical intellectual encounters of Taha Abdurrahman and the modernist, the Western ones. We would like to say that our system is interconnected, especially when it comes to the ethical system, and thus comparing the ethical intellect in the Arab world and the Western world is unfair. As a matter of fact, the West dealt with ethics as being fluid, but we think that ethics are stringent and immovable, perhaps fixed, or because they relate to our religion and they cannot be changing. So the system of ethics amongst the Muslims is different, and there is a yawning gap between our system and the Western system thereby, especially when it comes to the influence. Dr. Mu'taz provided plenty of information and plenty of ideas that were intense. You said that the children of the Islamic movements had suffered from intellectual shortage. Taha Abdurrahman didn't come from void. He studied the books of the previous scholars, and as you know, the Islamic movement is also plural. There are Islamic movements when it comes to the quality or the influence thereby. I think, yes, we need to investigate these issues, but I think they didn't have intellectual shortage as you have described. You've also compared Taha Abdurrahman and Al-Ghazali. Taha Abdurrahman, indeed, Taha Abdurrahman's era is different than Al-Ghazali. You meant Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, yes? Yes, indeed, there is a yawning gap between the two. One of them is a philosopher, the other is a jurist, a modern philosopher. I would like to thank you, but These just my comments, and this is my point of view. Thank you. Thank you very much. I haven't compared the Western intellect and the Arab one, or the two systems. I haven't compared the two, but what I said is to do with providing certain features at the behest of Mr. Mu'taz. Features of the Islamic ethical system from the perspective of Mr. Taha. He is not a binary kind of gentleman. He doesn't see the issue as us and them, as I understood from your comment. This is first. Second, I would like to reiterate briefly and say that Taha Abdurrahman, when he wanted to present the ethical philosophy from the Islamic context, he prioritized the following. He wanted to criticize the ethical Western philosophy. He didn't criticize the conduct of the people or the ethics of the lay persons. And thus, he criticized the thesis thereby, one after the other, and their kind of relationship with religion. Perhaps you were a bit confused in this nuance when I talked about some of the Western philosophers and some of the concepts, the Western concepts that are philosophical indeed. So there is no comparison between the two systems. In contrast, Dr. Taha wanted to present a new project, but still derives benefit from the Islamic context and emphasize the Islamic kind of imagination. And what he wanted is to refine such sources in order to become sources or roots that we might depend on in order to get along with the project for everyone. He talked about the universality of the project, not as a Muslim, but as a Muslim philosopher and as an ethical philosophy that might supplant the Western philosophy. I think I was clear in this. Thank you. When it comes to the questions that were posed to me, the difference between the the renewal of Arab intellect, thought, and the renewal of religion. Indeed, Al-Jabari used the word Arab reason. However, others used the Muslim reason, because Al-Jabari was a nationalist at a certain stage of his Zaki Najib Mahmoud, for example, Muhammad Abdul Jabari, and others had a secular background. So the renewal of religion emanates from a religious message, and that's why Taha is a very religious man, unlike Muhammad Abdul Jabari. Muhammad Abdul Jabari was a secularist, as I said, and a nationalist, because they wanted to delve into the Muslim tradition in order to emphasize the way we could reach Western modernity, because he renewed the thought in order to abolish one component and provide us with a further component. He wanted to dispense with Sufism and dispense with the bayan or diction, because the secular way of looking at modernity ought to be based on a philosophy, and that's why he used the Burhan, or the evidence-based philosophy that relates to the Greek or the Westerners. Ahmad Lutfi said when he wanted to establish a revival project, he translated the book entitled Ethics for Aristotle and Nicomacheus, because he hoped that this book will be influential in the Egyptian revival as it was influential in the French revival or Enlightenment. And the other point is to do with the numerous modernisms. I think Taha Abdurrahman uses plenty of levels when it comes to his discourse. He thinks indeed that modernism is not only one but numerous. And he also establishes the right to differ when it comes to philosophy. And he wanted to abolish also the European centrism or centrality in order to have parallel kind of centrality in other parts of the world. He also focuses on the nationalist side of philosophy. He says that we might think that philosophy is a universal kind of vision. He said no, it has also nationalist kind of roots, because he tackled a number of philosophies and he looked at the root of the nationality of each philosophy. So philosophy cannot be universal or genuinely universal, and all nationalities ought to have their own kind of philosophies in order to delegitimize the universality of the Western philosophy as well. And then he moves to religion. He thinks that religion is a universal concept because it relates to humans. It relates to the innate nature of humans. He refuses the Western autonomy because it is a key concept in applied ethics and in hospitals and in other aspects. He refuses the autonomy because the autonomy is to do with individuality rather than any other influence, but still religion is to do with our predisposition, our innate nature. Every single human leans to become religious, but there are certain obstacles. He indeed relates to this through the fitra, or the innate nature of humans. I'll move to the third question. What was his project in order, or program in order to have an ethical community? This is a good question. I think that he refuses activism or political activism because political activism would be peripheral in the revival of the intellectual revival or renaissance amongst the Arabs. However, he thinks that religion is an approach that ought to be combining rituals and management at the same time, i.e. politics and worshipping. And if he can emulate the political activity, or if the political activity would become would manifest itself in a good conduct, then so be it. Otherwise, it would lead to grabbing power. This is actually my explanation, not his explanation. So when it comes to having to grab power, then things will be different, rather than providing a political conduct that might lead to carrying out good deeds and so on and so forth. The political movements scrambled all to grab power, albeit the experience was also limited and brief. We can quote Sudan, Turkey, Egypt, and other experiences when it comes to political Islam. However, the other point is to do with the intellectual structure of Taha Abdul Rahman in order to get to what we aim for. He resorted to the political theories that depends on in the individual. So he prioritized the individuality when it comes to the refinement of the experience, because it is the source of becoming master of ourselves, and he relates this to worshipping as well as other nuances. I hope that I was clear in explaining his ideas. When it comes to the intellectual or shortage, Sheikh Al-Qardawi in his memoir talked about this shortage, and he said that we had met in the 80s in order to discuss this intellectual shortage. Jamal al-Din Atiyah was there, Taha al-Ilwani was there, Sheikh Al-Qardawi was there, and others. They held a meeting in Lugano to discuss this intellectual or thought-related shortage, and his memoir is brimful of such complaints. And up to this moment, the political Islamist movement do suffer from intellectual shortage because being activist in politics would supplant kind of delving into intellect. Sheikh Al-Ghazali and Sheikh Qardawi and others who were intellectuals, they were kicked out from some of the political Islamic movement. When it comes to Taha Abdurrahman and Imam Al-Ghazali, I'm not talking about Muhammad Al-Ghazali, I'm talking about Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali. So my idea was to do with my own words. I said that there are certain commonalities between the two men in some aspects, obviously, because they both combine the Sufi experience and philosophy. Al-Ghazali's experience is famous, and also Taha Abdurrahman is a Sufi and he has his own experience. Both of them try to make the external and the internal coherent. But I said that Al-Ghazali depended on the Greek philosophy and he delved into it. He did not boycott the Greek philosophy, especially through Avicenna and others. However, Taha Abdurrahman boycotted the Greek philosophy. Al-Ghazali wanted to make a religion coherent with the Greek philosophy in order to customize the Greek philosophy in Islam. So he provided intersections between the two, and indeed he was successful. He did not confront the revelation. He wanted to legitimize the Greek heritage and add certain Islamic flavor. However, Taha is different. Taha boycotted the European modernity, and that's why I said. Are there any further questions? In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, my question is addressed to Mr. Verzen regarding mysticism. What about the reoccurring phenomenon that we have witnessed in the past, starting with mysticism and passing through philosophy and returning back to mysticism? This what took place with Fakhr al-Razi, Ibn Daqiq al-Eid and Imam al-Ghazali. And what was strange is that the intellect Taha Abdurrahman, in an interview or in a meeting with Hamza al-Bouchishi, his sheikh, the head of the order, al-Bouchishi order, he said, and I quote, he had an insight, he had put me on the right path. What I read and what I write is just a drop in the ocean of this sheikh. And this took place in 2009, and he had described the sheikh of the Bouchishi order. In other position, he said those who forget the truth, God will make him forget himself. So would it be possible, for example, as I said, to go through philosophy or to start from Sufism and going through philosophy and come back to Sufism? My question is to Dr. Harvey. and he lives in London. What is the impact of Taha Abdul Rahman's writings when it comes to preaching for Islam in London? Have you benefited from Abdul Rahman's books in your preaching for Islam in London? Mr. Mu'taz, I hope that you will receive my criticism wholeheartedly. I think we need to have a philosophy that we could call critical philosophy. Dr. Mu'taz, when he talked about the thought of Taha Abdul Rahman, he followed the academic kind of order. However, he spiced it up, and when it comes to the religious discourse in the public space, when he talked about the intellectual shortage and the mental dervishes, and as Al-Akhdari said in his book, if we look at certain terms, we need to stick by it. Otherwise, if the terms are loose, this might lead to a different meaning. Because I'm a Sufi, I don't like to be criticized at the end of the day.
Would you like to answer this question? He was asking that if you...
إذا كانت بالنسبة
As far as your question is concerned, I think that Taha Abdul Rahman did not think of perhaps having a U-turn. His relationship with Hamza is old, and it is still continuing. What he said in 2009, he repeated it pretty much. He repeated pretty much the same words in 2017. He was in a hadra in a circle, a Sufi circle, and what you have said might be true when it comes to a number of intellects. However, when it comes to Taha, I think that he is a Sufi, and he would still be a Sufi up until his demise, and I hope he would have a prolonged life. The other issue is as follows. I am very certain in this regard, because his Sufism now and his practice of Sufism, following the order that you have mentioned, was theoretized kind of, and he mentioned this Sufi kind of nuance or flavor in his books. Well, I would like to give you an example. When he talked about the first conception of criticizing the issue of ethics being subject to religion, and when he talked about the two saints, Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, he indeed had added a mystic flavor. So I think when it comes to Taha, I think he will follow the Sufi path, and he won't U-turn on this. And in his philosophy, he tries to reiterate the status of the Sufi reason, and Harold had talked about these stages of reasons.
So I'm not an expert on Sufism or the tradition of Sufism. I come at this from a different angle, namely from contemporary Arab thought, and so I'll repeat it. I come at this. I come at Taha Abdul Rahman not from the angle of Sufism or the study of Sufism, but from the angle of Arab thought. So, any particular questions on the relationship between him and Sheikh Hamza, or about the Bushishi order, they're definitely not my field of expertise, so I wouldn't be able to give you a clear answer.
Bismillah. It's a very simple answer. As far as I'm aware, the thought of Taha Abdurrahman is not really known in London or the United Kingdom. His books are not translated into English, and his influence is small. Only, I would say, a few academic specialists may read and know his works, but beyond that, there's no influence in English, in the English-speaking world generally. He's gaining some prominence in recent years because in the English literature, because he's being quoted by a prominent academic called Wa'il Halaq, and that's probably the most prominence he's received recently. I think it would be a very good thing if some translation and some further spread of his thought could happen, and I hope that specialists will be able to do that.
طه عبد الرحمن باللغة الإنجليزية. وائل حلاق indeed translated one of his books, and you criticize me because I do criticize other people, and you ask me to accept criticism gladly. You don't want to be subject to criticism, but you do the opposite. Sheikh Al-Qaradawi did so. Perhaps your criticism might be leveled against Al-Qaradawi. No problems. If I and Al-Qaradawi in the same boat, there's no problem. And thus we conclude this symposium, and I would like to thank you.